The woman standing outside my gate looked like she had run out of places to go. Rain drummed against the wrought iron fence, turning the long driveway into a ribbon of reflected light. She clutched the handle of a worn suitcase with both hands, her shoulders trembling beneath a soaked gray coat. The security camera mounted above the entrance captured every detail, and from my office on the second floor, I watched the screen without saying a word. 5 years ago, she walked away from me without looking back. Tonight, she was asking for permission to come home. Funny how life works when time finally collects its debts. My name is Cole Harrison. I'm 45 years old, born and raised in Texas. Most people who know me now see the estate, the businesses, the polished trucks parked beneath covered garages, and assume I've always lived this way. They see success and think success is the whole story. It isn't. The truth usually starts long before anyone notices it. Outside, the rain intensified, rattling against the gate. The woman shifted her weight and glanced toward the security intercom. Even through the camera feed, I recognized the familiar shape of her face. Rebecca, my ex-wife. The woman who once looked me in the eye and said she refused to spend the rest of her life married to a poor man. 5 years had changed her. The confidence she used to wear like expensive perfume was gone. The sharp posture, the effortless smile, the certainty that tomorrow belonged to her alone. All of it had faded. Standing there now, she looked smaller somehow, as if life had been quietly removing pieces of her one season at a time. A buzz sounded from the gate station downstairs. My head of security appeared in the doorway of my office a moment later. "Mr. Harrison," he said carefully, "she says she needs to speak with you. She says it's important." I leaned back in my chair and looked past him toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the property. The house sat on nearly 40 acres outside Dallas. Rolling lawns, oak trees, a private pond catching silver streaks of rain. It was peaceful here, the kind of peace that takes years to build and only moments to lose. "Did she say why?" I asked. "No, sir. Just that she needs 5 minutes." 5 minutes. That was all she wanted now. 5 years ago, she hadn't even given me that. I stood and walked toward the window. Down below, headlights illuminated the gate entrance where Rebecca waited alone. Her suitcase rested beside her feet. A person doesn't arrive with luggage unless they have nowhere else to go. I knew that much. The strange thing was I didn't feel angry anymore. Not really. Time had worn the sharp edges down. What remained wasn't hatred. It was distance. The kind that forms when someone becomes a chapter instead of a future. I folded my arms and watched the rain slide down the glass. Rebecca thought tonight was the end of her story. She had no idea it was actually the beginning of one she should have understood 5 years earlier. Because everything standing behind me, the house, the land, the businesses, the life she was staring at through those gates, started the very night she left. And what happened after she walked away was something neither of us could have imagined. 5 years earlier, the rain had sounded different. Back then it struck the tin roof of my small auto shop on the edge of Dallas, each drop echoing through a building that smelled like motor oil, coffee, and long hours. I remember standing alone beneath a flickering fluorescent light when my phone vibrated with a message from Rebecca. "We need to talk." 4 words. Short, simple, final. By the time I drove home, the storm had already settled over the city. Water streaked across the windshield while the wipers struggled to keep up. Something felt wrong, but I could not have explained why. When I pulled into the driveway, every light inside the house was on. The living room glowed through the front windows like a stage waiting for an actor who had forgotten his lines. Rebecca stood near the fireplace wearing a navy coat. 2 suitcases rested beside the front door. Lucas sat curled up on the couch hugging a stuffed baseball. He was only 10 years old. The moment I stepped inside, I knew. Some truths announce themselves before a single word is spoken. Rebecca did not waste time. She held out an envelope. Divorce papers. The pages felt heavier than they should have. I stared at them while rain tapped against the glass behind me. For a moment, I thought there had to be another conversation hidden somewhere beneath all of this. A misunderstanding. A chance to fix whatever had broken. Instead, she folded her arms and looked at me with a disappointment that seemed years old. She said she was tired of waiting. Tired of hoping my business would become something more. Tired of watching other people move forward while we stayed in the same place. I listened quietly. Not because I agreed. Not because it did not hurt. but because sometimes the loudest sound in a room is the moment your future changes direction. Lucas began crying when she picked up her suitcase. He asked if she was coming back. Rebecca kissed the top of his head and told him she needed a different life. Then she walked out the front door without turning around. I stood frozen in the hallway long after the taillights disappeared. The house felt enormous after that. Empty rooms. Empty silence. Empty promises. Eventually, I carried Lucas upstairs and sat beside his bed until he fell asleep. He kept asking if everything would be okay. I told him yes, even though I had no idea if it was true. Near midnight, I drove back to the shop because I could not stand the quiet anymore. The storm was still moving across Dallas when I found a large certified envelope tucked beneath a stack of invoices on my desk. A law firm in Houston. I almost ignored it. Looking back now, that envelope was the dividing line between two completely different lives. At the time, all I saw was another piece of paperwork waiting for a tired man who thought he had already lost everything. The envelope sat on my desk while rain tapped against the shop windows. I stared at it for nearly 10 minutes before opening it. My hands were tired. My mind was somewhere else. Rebecca was gone. Lucas was asleep at home. My marriage had ended only a few hours earlier. The last thing I expected was for a law firm to change the direction of my life. The letter inside was signed by an attorney in Houston. At first, the language sounded like every legal document I had ever seen. Formal, dry, easy to ignore. Then I reached a sentence that made me stop breathing for a second. My great-uncle Henry Whitmore had passed away 3 months earlier. Since he had no children of his own, the majority of his estate had been left to a single beneficiary. Me. I read the paragraph again, then a third time. The fluorescent lights hummed above my head while the storm rolled across Dallas outside. Surely I had misunderstood something. Men like me did not inherit fortunes. Men like me spent 12 hours a day repairing engines and worrying about payroll. Men like me checked the price of gasoline before filling the tank. Yet the numbers printed on those pages remained exactly the same every time I looked at them. The estate was valued at more than $500 million. Land, investments, business holdings, trust accounts, assets spread across several states. I leaned back in my chair and laughed once. Not because it was funny, because sometimes reality becomes so unbelievable that your brain cannot decide what emotion belongs there. $500 million. The figure sounded absurd inside my little shop. I thought about calling someone. Then I realized there was nobody to call. Rebecca had already left. Most of my friends would assume it was a joke. Even I was struggling to believe it. The attorney's direct number was listed at the bottom of the page. I called immediately. A tired voice answered after the second ring. 20 minutes later, every detail had been confirmed. Uncle Henry had spent decades building investments that almost nobody in the family understood. He had always been private, quiet, the kind of man who drove old trucks despite owning enough money to buy half the county. According to the attorney, he respected hard work more than appearances. Apparently, he had been watching my life from a distance for years. When the call ended, I sat alone in silence. The rain had started to ease outside. Water slid down the windows in slow silver lines. Most people think receiving life-changing money would feel like fireworks. It did not. It felt heavy, heavier than any debt I had ever carried. Because while the world suddenly looked different, the problems waiting for me at home remained exactly the same. Rebecca was still gone. Lucas would still wake up tomorrow asking questions I could not answer. Money could solve many things. It could not fix that. I folded the documents carefully and locked them inside my desk drawer. Then I made a decision that would surprise a lot of people later. I was not going to tell anyone. Not yet. Not until I understood what kind of man I wanted to become after the worst night of my life unexpectedly became the most important one. The next morning began at 6 o'clock with the sound of Lucas moving around the kitchen. For a moment I forgot everything. Then reality settled back onto my shoulders. The divorce papers. The empty side of the bed. The documents locked inside my desk drawer. I poured coffee into an old ceramic mug and watched the sunrise spread across the neighborhood through the window above the sink. The world looked exactly the same as it had 24 hours earlier. That was the strange thing about life-changing moments. They happen quietly. Birds still sing. Traffic still moves. Children still need breakfast. Lucas sat across from me eating cereal. His eyes looked older than they had the day before. Children notice more than adults think they do. He stirred his spoon through the milk and finally asked the question I had been dreading. Are we going to be okay? I looked at him for a long moment. Then I nodded. Yes, we are. That promise became the foundation of everything that followed. Not the inheritance, not the money, not the businesses that would eventually come later. Just that simple promise across a kitchen table. We are going to be okay. Over the next few weeks, I met with attorneys, accountants, and financial advisors. Most of them expected excitement when discussing the estate. Instead, I asked questions. Hundreds of them. I wanted to understand every asset, every investment, every responsibility that came with it. Uncle Henry had not simply left money behind. He had left opportunities, companies, land, long-term holdings, entire systems that needed leadership. More importantly, he had left me a choice. I could spend the rest of my life reacting to what happened with Rebecca, or I could start building something bigger than the pain she left behind. I chose the second option. The first thing I did was keep my shop open. That surprised almost everyone involved. Several advisors suggested selling it immediately. They saw it as a small operation compared to the value of the estate. They did not understand what the place represented. That shop had carried me through difficult years. It paid for school clothes, birthdays, groceries, and mortgage payments. It deserved more respect than being discarded because a bank account suddenly looked different. So I kept showing up every morning. The difference was that now I had the ability to think long-term. Slowly, I began investing. A warehouse outside Fort Worth. A transportation company struggling after poor management decisions. A piece of commercial property most investors ignored because it required patience. I learned something important during that period. Wealth is not created by spending money. It is created by solving problems. Every business I purchased had challenges. Every investment required discipline. While the world imagined fortunes appearing overnight, the truth looked far less glamorous. Long meetings, spreadsheets, contracts, endless decisions. Meanwhile, Lucas remained at the center of everything. Baseball games, school projects, Saturday breakfasts. The more successful I became, the more determined I was not to miss those moments. Because money could replace many things. Time with your child was not one of them. Looking back now, those first months after receiving the inheritance shaped the next 5 years of my life. I thought I was learning how to manage wealth. What I was really learning was how to rebuild myself. Success has a strange way of hiding while it is being built. Most people imagine dramatic moments, headlines, celebrations, and instant transformations. My life did not work that way. 1 year passed, then 2, then 3. The businesses grew steadily. The warehouse expanded. The transportation company doubled its routes across Texas. Properties that seemed ordinary when I purchased them slowly became valuable as new developments spread outward from the city. I kept my head down and focused on the work. Every contract signed led to another opportunity. Every problem solved created another door. Meanwhile, Lucas was growing up faster than I was ready for. His voice became deeper. His little league games turned into middle school competitions. The boy who once needed help tying his shoes started talking about college and career plans. Those years became some of the happiest of my life, not because of money, but because peace had finally returned to our home. Rebecca, however, was living a very different story. I did not spend much time thinking about her, but news has a way of traveling. Mutual acquaintances mentioned things occasionally. At first, everything seemed perfect from the outside. The man she left with drove luxury vehicles, wore expensive watches, and talked confidently about investments and opportunities. Social media photographs showed vacations, rooftop restaurants, and smiling faces. Looking at those images, some people probably assumed she had made the right decision. But photographs only show what people want the world to see. What they never show is what happens after the camera is put away. Around the 3rd year, the story started changing. The luxury lifestyle became difficult to maintain. Business ventures that looked impressive on paper failed to produce results. Investments lost value. Debt quietly replaced confidence. One friend told me Rebecca and her new husband had moved twice in less than 18 months. Another mentioned constant financial pressure. I never asked for details. I simply listened and moved on. What surprised me most was not their financial problems. It was how familiar the pattern sounded. When times were good, everything appeared strong. When challenges arrived, cracks became impossible to hide. Looking back, I realized Rebecca had always been chasing security in the wrong places. She believed security came from appearances, expensive neighborhoods, expensive cars, expensive promises. But real security is built slowly. It comes from trust, discipline, patience, and people who remain beside you when circumstances are less than perfect. By the fourth year, the updates became less frequent. Then they stopped altogether. Life moved on. Lucas entered high school. I purchased additional acreage outside Dallas and began construction on what would eventually become our family estate. Every evening I would stand on the unfinished property watching workers frame walls against the Texas sunset. The air smelled of fresh lumber and cut grass. It felt like standing inside a future I never thought I would have. I believed that chapter of my life was permanently closed. I believed Rebecca had become nothing more than a memory. What I did not know was that somewhere beyond the life I was building, hers was beginning to fall apart in ways neither of us could have predicted. By the fifth year, the life Lucas and I had built barely resembled the one we left behind. The estate was finally complete. White stone, wide porches, towering oak trees, and enough land that the nearest neighbor felt miles away. Every detail had been designed with intention, not to impress strangers, but to create a place that felt permanent. A place where promises lasted longer than circumstances. Lucas was 15 now, nearly as tall as me. Some mornings I would catch a glimpse of him walking across the property with a baseball glove slung over his shoulder and wonder where the little boy from that kitchen table had gone. He carried himself differently these days. More confident, more grounded. He had learned lessons most teenagers never have to learn. He knew that people leave. He also knew that life continues afterward. One Saturday afternoon, we sat beside the pond behind the house. The Texas sun reflected across the water while a warm breeze moved through the grass. Lucas skipped a stone across the surface and watched it bounce 3 times before sinking. Then he asked a question that surprised me. "Do you ever think about Mom?" His voice was calm, not angry, not sad, just curious. I looked across the water for a moment before answering. "Sometimes." He nodded. "I do too. There was a time when conversations like that would have hurt. Now they felt different. Time had a way of turning wounds into scars. The memory remained, but the pain no longer controlled the story. That evening we drove into Dallas for dinner. As we passed through downtown, I caught my reflection in the truck window. 5 years earlier, I had been a man trying to survive a collapse. Now I was leading multiple companies, employing hundreds of people, and planning projects that stretched years into the future. Yet strangely enough, the accomplishment I felt most proud of was sitting beside me wearing a baseball cap and talking about school. Success looked impressive on paper. Fatherhood felt meaningful in real life. A few weeks later, I received a phone call from someone I had not heard from in years. An old mutual friend. The conversation started casually enough. Work, family, life. Then her tone changed. "Have you heard about Rebecca?" she asked. I had not. The silence on the line lasted a moment. Then the details began to emerge. The marriage she left for had ended months earlier. Financial problems had grown worse than most people realized. Properties had been sold. Debts had piled up. Relationships had fractured. Apparently, she had spent the last year moving from one temporary situation to another, trying to rebuild a life that kept slipping through her fingers. I thanked her for the information and ended the call. Then I sat quietly in my office staring out at the property. The sunset painted the horizon gold. Sprinklers moved across the lawn in slow arcs. Everything felt peaceful, yet something about that conversation lingered in the back of my mind. Not satisfaction, not revenge, just reflection. Because 5 years earlier Rebecca believed she was walking toward a better future. She never realized she was walking away from one. What I did not know was that while I sat there watching the sun disappear beyond the trees, she was already making plans that would bring her back into my life sooner than either of us expected. The rain was still falling when my security monitor showed Rebecca standing at the gate. Watching her through a screen felt strange. 5 years had passed, yet the image carried echoes of a life I barely recognized anymore. She shifted her suitcase closer to her leg and pulled her coat tighter against the weather. The woman who once chased certainty now looked exhausted by uncertainty. My head of security waited for instructions. I remained silent for several seconds. Then I nodded. The gate opened. Slowly, quietly. Rebecca stepped forward as if she was not entirely sure it was real. The long driveway curved through rows of oak trees before reaching the main house. I watched her walk the entire distance. She passed the pond, the gardens, The guest house. Every few steps, she seemed to glance around, taking in details she never imagined would belong to me. By the time she reached the front entrance, the rain had weakened to a mist. I met her in the foyer. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The marble floors reflected soft light from the chandeliers above. Water dripped from the edge of her coat onto the stone. 5 years ago, I would have searched for the right words. Now there were none. "Hello, Rebecca," I said. Her eyes filled with emotion almost immediately. "Cole." Just hearing my name in her voice again felt unfamiliar. Time changes more than appearances. It changes the spaces between people. I invited her inside. Nothing more. Nothing less. She stepped into the house and slowly looked around. The staircase curved toward the second floor. Family photographs lined the walls. Awards from business organizations sat in glass cases. Through the windows, the property stretched toward the horizon. She seemed unable to process everything at once. Then her gaze landed on a framed photograph near the fireplace. Lucas, dressed in a baseball uniform, smiling. Older, taller, nearly a man. She walked toward it without speaking. Her fingers stopped just short of touching the frame. "He has grown so much," she whispered. There was pain in her voice. Real pain. Not dramatic. Not theatrical. Just the quiet realization of years that cannot be recovered. Before I could answer, footsteps echoed from the hallway. Lucas entered carrying a sports bag over one shoulder. He stopped instantly. The room became completely still. Mother and son stared at each other across 5 years of absence. Neither seemed prepared for the moment. Rebecca covered her mouth with one hand. Tears formed in her eyes. Lucas stood frozen. The teenager before her was no longer the little boy she left behind. He was taller than she remembered, stronger, more confident. Life had continued without her. "Lucas," she said softly. His expression remained calm, but I could see the emotions moving behind his eyes. Surprise, confusion, distance. He glanced toward me briefly before looking back at her. The silence lasted longer than any conversation could have. In that moment, I think Rebecca finally understood something no amount of money could teach. Houses can be rebuilt. Careers can recover. Fortunes can be lost and found again. But time only moves in one direction. And standing in that foyer, surrounded by a life she no longer belonged to, she was face to face with every year she had willingly traded away. Lucas eventually excused himself and headed upstairs, leaving Rebecca and me alone in the living room. The sound of his footsteps faded into the second floor, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any argument could have. Rebecca sat on the edge of the couch, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee one of the staff had brought in. Steam drifted upward between us. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the grandfather clock near the fireplace marked each passing second. Finally, she looked up at me. "I made a mistake, Cole." Her voice cracked slightly. "The biggest mistake of my life." I listened without interrupting. 5 years earlier, I would have rushed to fill the silence. Now I simply let the truth arrive at its own pace. Rebecca stared down into her coffee. She talked about the years after she left. The financial struggles. The disappointments. The promises that never became reality. She described moving from place to place, trying to hold together a future that kept falling apart. There was no anger in her voice anymore. Only exhaustion. Then came the question I knew had been building since she walked through the front door. "How did you do all this?" Her eyes moved around the room. The house. The property. The life surrounding us. How did everything change so much? I leaned back in my chair and looked toward the windows overlooking the estate. The answer was sitting in a desk drawer 5 years ago. A single envelope. A single decision. A single night. "Do you remember the evening you left?" I asked. She nodded slowly. "I remember every minute of it." I held her gaze. "A few hours after you drove away, I received a letter from a law firm." Confusion crossed her face. Then curiosity. Then concern. I told her about Uncle Henry. The inheritance. The businesses. The land. The investments. Every detail. I spoke calmly, the same way I might describe the weather. Yet with every sentence, the color slowly drained from her face. By the time I finished, she looked completely stunned. "You are saying?" Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "You inherited everything that same night." I nodded. The room went still. Rebecca blinked several times as though her mind refused to accept what she had heard. She looked away toward the windows. toward the property, toward the life she had spent the last hour trying to understand. Then the realization finally reached her. Not dramatically, not all at once. It settled over her like a shadow. The night she walked away believing she was escaping a failed future was the exact night everything changed. She lowered her head into her hands. Tears slipped through her fingers. If I had stayed, she whispered. I shook my head gently. That is the wrong question. She looked up. Then what is the right one? I thought about it for a moment. Would you have stayed if the letter had never arrived? The question hung in the air between us. Rebecca opened her mouth, but no words came out. Because deep down, we both already knew the answer. Rebecca looked away first. The silence that followed answered the question better than words ever could. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Moonlight reflected across the pond beyond the windows, turning the water silver against the darkness. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Rebecca wiped her eyes and nodded slowly. No, she said. I probably would not have stayed. There was no anger in her voice. No excuses. Just honesty. Sometimes the truth arrives years late, but when it finally comes, it does not need decoration. I respected her for saying it. More than that, I respected the fact that she did not try to argue with reality. She understood what had happened. Not just the inheritance, not just the money, the choices, the priorities, the values that had led both of us to this moment. She looked around the room one last time. At the photographs, at the home, at the life that had been built without her. Then she asked the question that had been hanging between us since she arrived. Is there any chance for us? I took a deep breath before answering. 5 years ago, I would have given almost anything to save my marriage. 5 years ago, I would have stayed awake all night searching for a way to make things work. But people change. Time changes them. Pain changes them. Growth changes them. The man sitting across from Rebecca was not the same man she left behind. No, I said gently. There is not. Tears filled her eyes again, but she nodded as if she already knew. The truth did not surprise her. It simply hurt. I am sorry, Cole. I believe she meant it. I know, I replied. And strangely enough, that was enough. Not because it fixed the past. Nothing could do that. But because forgiveness is not always about restoring a relationship. Sometimes it is simply about setting down a burden you no longer want to carry. We spoke for another hour. About Lucas. About life. About mistakes. Then I had one of the guest rooms prepared for the night. The next morning, Rebecca left quietly. No dramatic farewell. No final argument. Just a simple goodbye. I watched her car disappear down the driveway the same way I once watched her leave years earlier. The difference was that this time, I did not feel abandoned. I felt at peace. Lucas joined me on the porch after she was gone. Together we stood beneath the Texas sky and watched the sun rise above the trees. Life had not given me the future I expected. It had given me a different one. And looking back, I would not trade it. Because money did not save me. Success did not save me. The inheritance did not save me. What saved me was learning that your worth is never determined by who leaves. It is determined by who you become afterward. And now I have a question for you. If you were in my position, would you have made the same choice, or would you have given Rebecca a second chance? Share your thoughts in the comments because I would genuinely like to know. And if stories like this remind you that setbacks do not have to define your future, consider subscribing to the channel and joining us for more journeys about resilience, choices, and the unexpected turns that shape our lives.